Could you tell us what your future vision and roadmap is for EOS? I think you alluded to Twitter. There was a whole new roadmap ahead, and we're really excited to hear more about
that. Wow, I've never been more excited about the potential. Ever since I wrote my book on More Equal Animals, The Subtle Art of True Democracy, I've really identified the principles for decentralization, where democracy is defined as rule by all of the people, not some of the people over the rest of the people. And achieving rule by all of the people is a really challenging thing in light of all kinds of other natural things like Pareto distribution of resources, the Pareto distribution of wealth, of media influence, incumbent advantage, and on and on and on, that consistently and reliably, time and time again, puts 1% of the people in control of the rest who don't have power to change the consensus. They're just stuck with whoever's in charge, whether it's block producers and exchanges on EOS, or mining pool operators and mining operations on Bitcoin, or the two-party system in the United States. Like, why can't we change these things? And it's not just a matter of, well, if we just elected the right people. No, there's structural problems that have created this mess. So I've been, studying, nature and things like that, and identified some principles of a true democracy, of how to return power to the people. And I think that currency need to be governed by principles of true democracy. Otherwise, every single cryptocurrency, if it got to the position of the Fed, the Federal Reserve, it would be as centralized or more centralized than the Federal Reserve, which is comprised of, like, I don't know, 5 or 6 different regions and so forth. They've got their own mode of decentralizing it, which is a little bit more robust than the governance process put in place by a lot of the blockchains out there that have ad hoc, behind the scenes governance that determines which hard forks and which code gets merged, and all those things. So my vision for EOS is a DAO of DAOs. It's to implement truly decentralized governance based on the principles of fractal design. Fractal patterns occur all throughout nature. It's like how galaxies look like hurricanes, look like microscopic phenomena. It's the same pattern at all scales. And with a fractal design, you want democracies of democracies of democracies. Right? You don't want one democracy of 200 million people. You want a democracy of 50 states, which are comprised of democracies of 100 counties, which are comprised of democracies of 100,000 people. And you have separation between the layers, but then collaboration. So I think that the future of this is the governance of EOS needs to be a democracy of democracies. So you have lots of different communities. You have the English community, the Korean community, the Chinese community, the Russian community, the Spanish, Argentinian community. All these different communities need to be locally governed, and then they each need to appoint representatives to an organization like the EOS Network Foundation, which can then be a democracy of DAOs, where each DAO gets one vote or equal representation at the higher level DAO. And then, underneath those DAOs, you'd have sub DAOs and so on, all the way down, right? And in this approach, we can have representation that's independent of token holder weight, but instead based upon, hey, we have a community of people that's depending on common infrastructure. If we're all, the Eden community and the Vigor community and the Violet Garden community and the Chinese community, all these communities have a common interest, but currently the only way they can resolve it is by token weighted. And if, the Chinese have all the tokens, then English DAOs have no representation. And who wants to build a community on a chain in which you don't have practical representation? So the other principle from my book is independence, right? Independence by design. A county should be able to secede from a state, which should be able to secede from a nation and from world government. Right? If you don't have the power to secede, you don't have the power to say no, then you're not given consent, and without consent, you don't have a democracy. So things have to be independent by design, and that means each DAO needs to be independent. And I think that the future of DAOs is actually the path to inter-blockchain communication, because many DAOs can be born on EOS, and as they mature and grow, they can move from the EOS network to their own chain, but still maintain an economic link. So I see a future where each of these DAOs, each of these communities, the English community, the Chinese community, so forth, has their own local token, which they use to incentivize their own local growth with their own local governance practices, but they're all linked together to mutual funding of Bancor style market makers, so that they have interest in each other. It's like Apple investing in IBM and IBM investing in Apple. Now you've got aligned interest toward using EOS as sort of like the international settlement currency, and then you have local currencies. And I really see that if you want to have a future of a decentralized, self-governing, properly fractal and independent communities, you need to have fractal tokens in the sense that a token is not just one token that everyone uses, but it's one token with sub-tokens, and those local communities can grow as fast as they can grow, and they receive the majority of the benefit of their local growth, but they share the local growth with the global community, and the global community can seed these local communities with funding to bootstrap the local communities and get them growing. I think that's the fastest way to grow the EOS network, to motivate people to contribute to the network. And in doing so, EOS becomes not only the largest DAO, but it's a fractal DAO. And it's not just fractal in terms of governance, but it's fractal in terms of token ownership and relationships between the tokens. And with that approach, we can get massive economic and political and other growth in the EOS ecosystem.
So, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. So I'll try and remember everything, because it's really, really fascinating and interesting. So the first kind of element I want to address is, you mentioned the Pareto principle, which is 20% versus 80%, right? Loosely. And I guess that's the naturalisation of centralisation of capital and everything else. So I just wondered, could you talk a little bit about why that's such a problem in today's democracies, and how Eden on EOS and how your fractal system can eradicate that problem?
Sure. So Pareto principle is that 20% of the people control 80% of the wealth. It can also be 10% of the people control 90% of the wealth, right? There's different variations, but it's basically a small number controls the majority of the whole. And ironically enough, the Pareto principle is itself fractal, which means that 4% of the people control 64% of the wealth, and 1% of the people control 51% of the wealth, assuming an 80-20 ratio. And that applies to all areas in nature. It's the number of people in cities, it's the number of peas in pods, it's the number, number of employees that are producing value for a company compared to all employees, right? 20% of employees provide all the value to the company, the other 80% are dead weight. And try as you made it to eliminate it, you can't. That's what communism tries to do, is tries to eliminate by making everyone equal, and that just impoverishes everyone. The consequence is that it also applies to influence. So 20% of the people can have 80% of the influence in the media, which then if you have a democracy, then it's not actually representing the people, because the people don't actually get to speak. The people that get to speak are the 1% that control 51% of all communications. Right? So is that ruled by the people, or is that ruled by whoever's at the top of whatever Pareto distribution is in play? So the larger a system gets, the more extreme the Pareto comes into play. If you were trying to find which country would have the tallest people, a country with a large population or a country with a small population, like, you bet that the large country will have the tallest person, and it'll probably have the tallest 10 people compared to a small country, which, because it's a smaller sample size, is not as likely to have the tallest people because of they're way out there on the bell curve. Well, if you have a political game that favors corruption, which country is going to have the most corrupt people? Well, the most corrupt people are going to be found, like the smartest psychopaths, sociopaths out there are going to be in a country with a large population. But whether you're a small country or a large country, you only have so many seats in the top of government, right? You got a president and a Congress and whatnot. So regardless of the size of your country, you got the same number of people. But the larger your country gets, the more extreme the psychopaths are in their skill and talent and corruption. And they fill all the slots, leaving very little room to chance. Like in a small country, random, honest people can end up in government, and because there's only so many psychopaths to go around. But in a big country, there's more than enough psychopaths to fill all the places of government. So you have to manage scale of your democracy, which is why if you don't want a democracy of 200 million people, you want the smaller democracies of 10,000 people that then form democracies of democracies. At each level, it is democratic, and you don't get the psychopaths bubbling up to the top. The other aspect is for the people to be in charge, you got to fight rational ignorance, which is no one has the time to know everything. And when you do global elections, like everyone's trying to elect a president or vote on monetary policy, the expectation that the voters can be informed enough to cast a meaningful vote is ridiculous. They're more misinformed than informed. So you don't want to do things on a global scale, which is why you don't want to do things with one global currency, whether it's Bitcoin or dollars. It needs to be at a local scale, and so you can have them come together. And so I see a future where all cryptocurrencies can form a federation of cryptocurrencies where they all appoint representatives, and now they can all manage settlements and stuff between them. That's a more democratic, that causes more power to be in the hands of the people. Because if you have a local currency, you have more say at the local level. And the reason why we got cryptocurrency and Bitcoin in the first place is because of the centralized nature. Means the average person has no say over monetary policy. And yet, they're printing trillions of dollars, and we have nothing we can do to vote. But locally, you got a lot more say. If you had a local currency, that local currency could have a completely different monetary policy than the national currency. And then you'd be independent and you'd have some say. So that's why I think we need to design our currencies and our systems of government and economics in a fractal structure. The key thing of a fractal structure is like a tree. You can take off any branch and plant it, and it's independent. And I think that's actually one of the problems with the way Block.one was governed. Instead of being a fractal structure internally, where you've got teams that delegate power down, and you've got similar design where you got marketing and developers and legal operating independently, they had silos, or they have a legal department, a marketing department, a development department, which meant it wasn't fractal and it wasn't able to effectively delegate authority and power down into the arms, and therefore decisions were checkpointed at the top. Right, Brendan and me, we only had so much time to evaluate all the things in the community and come up with our own business. But with a fractal design, you can push decisions down lower and make sure that the incentives are aligned at the lowest level possible. So I see the future of EOS as the DAO of DAOs, and I'm working with the EOS Network Foundation to pioneer the next generation governance process that allows anyone who wants to contribute to a community to show up every week and earn tokens for contributing to that community. It's kind of like the Eden process, except done every week. And instead of picking people that you're going to fund and then having to trust their promises, you pick people who've already contributed the most and are the most underappreciated. And those are the people that you reward, and you leverage the wisdom of the crowds, where every person only has to evaluate those close to them on any given week, and they don't have to consider global information and come up with global strategy and manage global budgets. It's just too much centralized decision making, whether it's in a single foundation or whatnot. So I want to decentralize the decision making, decentralize the allocation of capital, and flip it around so people contribute to the community first, and then that contribution is recognized, instead of having everyone contribute a bunch of money to centralized management and then hope that they can manage that money to benefit everyone else. And then everyone just says they're complaining, but they've already made the contribution and given up the power. So anyway, I know I've been rambling a lot, but I'm very excited about what's going on.
That's great. So a couple of questions, just to go back to the original principle. I wondered then, you mentioned that 200,000 or 100,000 is too big a democracy. You said 10,000 is kind of maybe the sweet spot. I just wondered, is then that 10,000 person or approximately 10,000 person limit critical to making this system work? And is the only way to extend it past 10,000 to have your democracy as a democracy, so to have the democracies cooperate with each other?
Yes, I believe that, a typical county in the United States has, under 100,000 people, 50,000 people or so. That's about the largest level at which point you no longer know everyone, and there's no longer ability to have accountability or reputation between people, and so on and so forth. And decisions cease being local, right? They're so far removed from you, and your voice compared to the whole shrinks. So if you think about it, if you're one vote out of 200 million, vote or don't vote, you're more likely to die on the way to the poll than to make a difference in the world. Difference in the outcome.
Nice way to put it.
Right?
It's true.
So with the fractal approach, instead of being one vote out of 200 million, you're one vote out of 60. It's 4 million times more powerful, because you convince 5 people, and then if you win, you convince another 5 people, and you can get all the way to the top, having only ever had to talk to 60 people. And then if you follow that same tree for your representatives, there's only 60 people you have to reach out to and talk to get your opinion known, and you have the ability to secede. All those things mean that under a fractal democracy, you have millions of times more influence, millions of times more individual power than if it was all done under one global democracy.
Do you see the segmentation then being, you've alluded to being geographical, but we were just giving out examples. I wonder, how do you envision the segmentation of communities?
I think you can segment them across multiple dimensions, geographical and interest. I would expect that imagine you had a social media YouTube, that's one interest. You can have a sports DAO that's all about sports fans and wants people to get there. And then you can have, your state-based, there's all the Californians and all the Texans. And then you can have city-based, right? And so
you could be more than one DAO. You could be in more than one community.
You can have more than one interest group that you're in. Obviously, you only have so much time, so you have to pick and choose which ones you're going to attend every week. But just like you can't live in every city, you pick a city, and when you contribute locally, it has the maximum impact on your city relative to the world. And you don't care what's going on in the rest of the world as long as your city is taken care of, really. So it really aligns those interests. So by analogy, you can have a social media community that then splits into topics. Here's the politics community, here's the sports community, here's the science technology community, and here's the religious community, and they all go their ways. And then you can have, the state of Texas can have its own community, and when there's enough people in Texas that there's a critical mass in say the city of Dallas or Austin, they form a new sub-community there, and then they start growing that one, and it just grows and fractals. In Texas, wanting to grow, has incentive to subsidize Dallas and Austin communities to grow, because when they grow, Texas grows. Likewise, EOS has incentive to see Eden grow, and Eden has incentive to see other Eden-based communities grow underneath it. And that fractal structure of governance and fractal alignment of incentives and rewards at the local level is how the global system grows the fastest and is most sustainable.
So talk to me a little bit more about how the token economics will work. So from what I understand is each community would have its own DAO token, and that would be an EOS token. And then that would somehow work with liquidity pool. And that would, I assume, the more success each community have, the more EOS it would have in the liquid pool. Is that correct? Am I understanding it right? I'll let you explain it.
All this stuff is cutting edge. It's being evolved and tweaked. I haven't released my white paper yet. I'm still enhancing it. I have been discussing in the Telegram chats different ideas and theories to get early feedback from the community. So, I don't want to say that anything I'm saying right now is the final plan, but generally speaking, the idea is that any two cryptocurrencies can align interests, form an alliance by mutually funding a market maker between the two currencies. And my current thinking is that the way they do that is to subsidize token holders to provide the liquidity. So instead of providing liquidity directly, they provide extra yield to the people who put tokens into the market maker and are willing to take the market maker risk. That's a way that you can magnify the amount of EOS, and you ensure that all the inflation paid by the EOS network or the Eden community token or the local DAO, whatever that DAO is, whether it's a DeFi DAO or whatnot, both DAOs contribute to incentivizing liquidity between the two. And the more liquidity there is between the two, they both benefit from that added liquidity, and all that inflation is compensating people who are providing a service to both communities. So both communities inflate by 1%, and they both use that to fund liquidity between them. And now there's all kinds of liquidity. That's a way of bootstrapping liquidity and aligning interest between any pair of tokens. And my belief is that communities that are able to form alliances with the most communities are going to grow the fastest, compared to communities that say, you know what, we don't need to fund a market maker between us and that other token. We're just going to help them out, and they're going to suck our value out. Well, at the end of the day, that's like saying we don't need to trade with China or anyone else and encourage that type of thing. We just produce everything at home. You can do that, but you're not going to grow as fast as if you could tap into world trade.
So is this concept of aggression from your book, More Equal Animals? Because that was one of the things that I felt like originally the book maybe didn't kind of take the advantages of globalization on board. It kind of pushed them to one side, I felt. And there are obviously advantages of globalization and some centralization, as we've seen with EOS. So I just wondered, then the idea then of the communities is those who communicate and negotiate with the most other communities, they're going to have the largest liquidity, or they're going to have the most value to their token. Is that correct?
Yes. Now, the reason, the thing I was advocating in my book was independence, and ensuring that you don't become overly dependent on any other community, right? Your county doesn't become overly dependent on the state and so forth. Because if you don't have that independence, then you lose the ability to say no. But as long as you're independent, it absolutely makes sense to trade with other communities, as long as you don't become dependent on that trade. And that's the thing that you have to look out for as you're designing these things. And so I think it's just a nuance. When I wrote my book, I didn't have the word fractal or the fractal paradigm to explain things. I was describing a very fractal solution and the principle of that, which means it's self-similar at every level, which means that if you're sovereign at the top, you need to be sovereign at the bottom. If you're independent at the top, you need to be independent at the bottom. Each branch can separate from the trunk and still survive. But obviously, it does better if you're connected to the tree and you have the advantage of all the root systems instead of having to grow a new root system, which, by the way, is two fractal systems, right? The tree above ground is fractal and below ground is fractal. And then they team up, and that's liquidity between the two that allows two fractal systems to work together.